Hi everyone, this video will break down how Azure Data Factory pipelines work and cover a hands-on demo to help you create your first Data Factory pipeline. Let's get started. So how does Data Factory pipelines work? Imagine we have a scenario where a postman wants to deliver a small parcel from a mailbox to your letterbox. We are going to need a key, know where the mailbox is located, and a description of the parcel so that the postman can grab the correct small parcel from the mailbox. After having done so, the postman is able to start making the delivery. Of course, we also need some sort of information about how the customer wants it to be delivered and where the small parcel should be delivered, so we will need the location of the letterbox. Lastly, we will also need the key to the letterbox so that the postman can safely place the mail in the letterbox. Now, as you can imagine, this process is completed by the postman. Normally, a post office would have multiple postmen, so that means that there's going to be a mail manager that will be supervising all the postmans out there. But how would this process relate to Data Factory if we replace the mailbox with a blob storage and our letter with a taxi CSV file? Essentially, we would like to move the CSV data in the blob storage using Data Factory to a target system. But to first move it using Data Factory, we will need to get a key and an address of this CSV file. In Data Factory, this is called a link service where it defines the connectivity to this blob storage and authorization to access the data, which acts like a key. Additionally, we need to create an object that is called dataset, where this is simply a definition of this taxi CSV file, and this definition defines what kind of data we're actually pulling from the blob storage once we actually successfully authorize through link service. But next, we're going to need something called copy activity. Basically, any kind of job in Data Factory is an activity, and the most popular one is copy activity, which moves data from one place to another. And of course, we also need to know where do we need to move the data to, and in this case, we are going to move it to the SQL database and into the taxi table. The same as with the blob storage, we are going to need a link service that will allow us to know how to connect to SQL database and where is that SQL database located. Lastly, we will of course need another dataset which will tell us once we get the data from the CSV file, how is the taxi table structured so we can put it in there. In this example, the postman is the one that is handling the entire job is called the integration runtime. This is the workforce of the Data Factory that's actually handling all the pipeline jobs. And the delivery manager is actually the Data Factory, so it's actually overseeing all the integration runtime and all the jobs that's actually happening. You can also run multiple integration runtime jobs with something called pipelines. Pipelines can be one copy activity, although it's usually more than one. But when you do, just remember that underneath each of these copy activity, there will always be two datasets where one is the source dataset and the other is the sync dataset. Each of these datasets will need access to a link service that will tell us how do we connect to the source of the data or the target and where do we put the data in. But in reality, you do not need to create this many link services because if you are pulling it from the same source, you can actually share the link service between them, and the same goes for the target, which you also can share it for. And this is the typical scenario that you use Data Factory for. Having understand how data pipelines work in Data Factory, let's try some hands-on demo in creating our pipeline where we will be importing the taxi CSV file from the blob storage into Azure SQL Database. So to start off, let us first create our Azure resources, which are primarily the blob storage and the SQL database. So right now, if you do not see them under your Azure services, you can go ahead to the top at the search bar and type in blob, and you can see storage accounts. Go ahead and click on it, and click on create next. And make sure your subscription and resource group are selected appropriately, and give the storage account a name. And for the region, always choose the region that is closest to you because that will reduce the latency and improve the performance. For the primary service, we leave it as it is, same for performance. And for redundancy, let's select locally redundant storage, which is more suitable for our demo. Next, for advanced networking and data protection, encryption, and tags, we can leave them as it is and move forward with creating our storage account. So while the creation of the blob storage is in progress, let's go ahead and create our Azure SQL Database. So I'll search for SQL Database, click Create, and select the appropriate subscription and resource group as my blob storage. For the database, let's give it a name. For server, because we have yet to create our SQL server, so let's go ahead and create a new SQL server. For the location, once again, I'll be choosing Southeast Asia. As for the authentication method, let's select Use SQL Authentication and set up our server admin login and password credentials. Following that, let's size up our SQL database. As you can see, the estimated cost is about $416 USD, and that's a bit too large for our current workload. So for the workload environment, let's switch it to development. And for the compute and storage, let's reconfigure it. So for the service tier and the compute tier, it's alright to leave it as it is to be general purpose and serverless. And for the hardware configuration, it is fine as it is. And for max core and min core, let's make sure that it's as lowest too. For autopause delay, let's reduce the autopause to its lowest, which is at 15 minutes. As for the data max size, let's reduce it to 1 GB. And as you can see, the estimated storage cost and compute cost has decreased significantly. For backup storage redundancy, we can leave it as locally redundant. As for networking, let's select the public endpoint and select yes for both, allowing Azure services and resources to access the server and adding our current client IP address. For the connection policy and encrypted connections, so we can leave it as it is. And I believe the subsequent configurations are fine as it is. So we can go ahead and create our Azure SQL database. So while our Azure SQL database is being created, let's go back and check back on our blob storage. As you can see, the blob storage deployment is complete. So let's go to our resource. And let's create a container for our blob storage itself. So let's call this the input blob. Once we have created our input container, let's go ahead and bring in our taxi CSV file. So let's click on upload and drag the CSV file in. Now, as you can see, it's pretty fast. It is successfully uploaded. So let's go ahead and view this CSV file. And as you can see, this is the classic CSV format that we are all very familiar of. Now let's head back to the SQL database and wait for the deployment to complete. Now that the Azure SQL database and the SQL server has been successfully deployed, let's head over to our Azure SQL database. And as you can see within the resource, there's this feature called the query editor. So let's go ahead and click on it and key in the credentials that we have set up previously. And similar to a normal database, you can see that the interface has tables, views, and the stored procedure. So previously, I've already created the script for creating the table in the database, which will be subsequently used when we are using the data factory to run the pipeline. So let's go ahead and run this command. And as you can see, the query has succeeded. And we can see that the table has been successfully created in the database itself, which will serve as the sync dataset for the SQL database. So right now we have finished setting up our Azure resources, both the Blob Storage and the SQL database. So let's move on to creating pipelines from our Azure Data Factory. So for those of you who have yet to create your Azure Data Factory, feel free to look at my previous video where there's a hands-on demo on how you can create your own Azure Data Factory. So once you have reached the Azure Data Factory landing page, go ahead and click on the author icon, which looks like a pencil. And following that, click on the plus icon and we can start creating our pipeline. So as you can see, after clicking on a pipeline, you see that the canvas pops up. And previously, we were talking about how we can use the ingestion of data from blob storage to SQL database, and that's primarily used by the copy activity. And we can find that under the move and transform category. And so let's go ahead and drag out the copy activity and bring it into the canvas. Perhaps let's rename this activity to copy data blob to SQL database. Following that, you can see that we need to configure the sync and the source dataset. So previously, as you recall, earlier part of the video, source dataset refers to the data that is actually being defined at our source itself, which is our blob storage. And subsequently, same for the sync dataset, it's how we define the data that's residing in our sync system, which is our Azure SQL database. So let's first do it for our source, which is residing in the blob. So after clicking on new, let's search for our blob storage and select delimited text because we have uploaded a CSV file previously. And let's rename it as source dataset blob. And as you recall, we also require a link service to our source dataset, which acts as an authorization and a key for us to allow us to access the data in our blob storage. So we can leave it as it is, and in our authentication type, there's quite a fair bit, but we'll leave it as default, which is using the account key itself. So under Azure subscription, let's click on the same subscription and the storage account name that we have created just now. And let's go ahead and test the connection. And the connection is successful, so it means that the link service will be able to authenticate successfully to our blob storage. So in the file path, let's click on the browse icon and you can see the input container that we've created just now, and within this input container, there lies the taxi CSV. So let's go ahead and select it. And as for the import schema, we'll leave it as it is. Same for the first row as header. As you recall, the CSV file has a header row. So let's go ahead and click on OK. So now that we have established the source dataset and the source link service, let's go ahead and preview the data to make sure that everything is working fine. As you can see, the data is nicely in a tabular format. So let's move on to our sync dataset, which is in our SQL database. So let's select SQL database, rename it as sync dataset. SQL database. And let's create a new link service for our Azure SQL database. So in our Azure subscription, let's select Azure subscription 1, the server that we have created, and the database that we have created too. So as you recall, previously we set up the SQL authentication. So let's key in the username and password once again. And let us test the connection. It seems like the connection is successful, so let's go ahead and create this link service to our Azure SQL database. So when we were to drop down for the table itself, you can see that it actually shows the the table that we created from the SQL database using the query editor previously. So let's go ahead and click on it, and let's make sure that the import schema from connection store is actually selected, and let's click on OK. So now that everything is working fine, and let's leave all this configuration as it is. Let's go ahead and validate our pipeline. Seems like our pipeline is validated and no errors has been found. So let's publish this first to save our configuration. So the publishing has been successful. And given that we have created our source and sync dataset and link service, we can move forward in running the pipeline. Let's go ahead and run this pipeline and see how the data is being moved from our blob storage to our SQL database. Let's wait for it to run a while. As you can see, the configurations that we have configured previously, it's all being written here. So the pipeline has actually succeeded. So let's go to our SQL database to see if the data has been populated. So let's select the top 1000 rows. As you can see, in the SQL database, the data has been populated from the blob storage into the SQL database. Now that wasn't too hard, was it? It took us about 12 minutes for us to create the resources as well as the setting up of the pipelines as well as running the entire pipeline. I hope that you've learned how to set up your own Azure Data Factory pipelines, and subsequently in the future you'll be able to integrate with other Azure resources. If you like this video, please leave a comment, subscribe, or leave a like, and I'll see you next time.